but with a heart so vast and steady, it intimidated my family from the day they met him. For the first time in my life, I wasn't being evaluated on what I could offer or how compliant I could be. Mark loved me unconditionally. He listened to me, supported my career, and brought a gentle, soothing warmth into my chaotic world. When I finally brought Mark home to introduce him to my parents, George didn't even stand up to shake his hand. He sat in his leather armchair, crossed his arms, and treated Mark like a trespassing criminal. My father was a man who demanded total submission from everyone in his orbit. He couldn't stand Mark because Mark didn't flinch under his gaze. Mark was educated, financially independent, and most offensively to George, completely unimpressed by his intimidation tactics. When Mark proposed 2 years later, I went to my parents' house alone to share the news, foolishly hoping for a smile or a hug. Instead, George stood over the dining room table, his face flushing deep red, and slammed his palm onto the wood. He told me that if I married Mark, I was spitting in the face of my family. He demanded I break off the engagement immediately and marry someone from his business circle, someone he could control. I stood there, my knees shaking, looking at my mother Sylvia. She just stared at her lap, refusing to meet my eyes. That was the moment something snapped inside me. For 30 years, I had surrendered my choices to make them happy, but looking at the life I could have with Mark versus the prison my father wanted to keep me in, I finally found my voice. "I am marrying Mark, Dad," I said quietly, "and I'm not asking for your permission." George's response was swift and merciless. He officially disowned me that very evening. He drafted a bitter email to our entire extended family, declaring that I was dead to them, a disgraced daughter who had betrayed her bloodline. He explicitly stated that I was stripped of any future inheritance and forbade anyone in the family from contacting me. Ethan, my husband Mark, held me for hours as I cried that night. He promised me that we would build our own family, one rooted in respect, peace, and protection, and we did. For 2 years, we lived in a sunny home in Austin, far away from George's shadow. But deep inside the quietest corners of my heart, a lingering grief remained, a foolish, stubborn hope that one day my father would realize his cruelty and choose to be my dad again. To truly understand the twisted sickness that festered inside my family, you have to understand my younger sister, Hannah. Hannah was 4 years younger than me, and from the day she took her first breath, my parents treated her like she was made of fine china, while I was built for heavy labor. If I scored 95% on an exam, George would ask why I lost 5 points. If Hannah managed to pass a class, my parents would throw a celebratory dinner. My father doted on her every whim. He bought her a brand new convertible for her high school graduation, paid off her credit card debts without a second thought, and shielded her from every consequence her poor decisions created. My mother, Sylvia, treated Hannah like an extension of herself, pampering her and enabling her spoiled demeanor. Naturally, Hannah grew up believing that the world owed her everything she desired, simply because she existed. When Hannah married her husband 5 years ago, my father spared no expense, hosting a grand, lavish wedding in downtown Austin that cost more than my entire college fund. But shortly after the honeymoon, the picture-perfect life Hannah had envisioned began to crumble. She and her husband wanted to start a family right away, but as month after painful month passed, nothing happened. After 3 years of failed attempts, specialized medical testing revealed a brutal truth. Hannah had a severe, non-treatable uterine condition. She was permanently, completely infertile. The diagnosis shattered my family, but instead of offering quiet, grounded support, my parents turned Hannah's infertility into a dark, dramatic crusade. George and Sylvia didn't just sympathize with Hannah, they adopted her grief as their own personal tragedy. Family dinners, which I only heard about through distant cousins, revolved entirely around Hannah's heartbreak. George spent tens of thousands of dollars sending Hannah to top fertility clinics across the country, but every doctor returned the exact same verdict: Hannah would never carry a child. Bitterness took root in Hannah's soul. She became obsessed with other people's families, openly despising women who got pregnant. And my parents fed that bitterness, convincing her that life had dealt her a cruel, unfair hand, while lesser people enjoyed the blessings she deserved. Meanwhile, in our quiet home in Austin, Mark and I were ready to begin our own next chapter. After a year of trying, I sat on the edge of our bathroom tub on a cool October morning, staring at a little white stick. Two vibrant pink lines stared back at me. When our obstetrician performed my first ultrasound at 8 weeks, she smiled, adjusted the wand, and turned the monitor toward us. Two distinct, tiny heartbeats were flickering side by side on the screen. We were expecting twin boys. Mark dropped to his knees right beside my examination bed, resting his forehead against my arm, sobbing tears of pure, unadulterated joy. I wept right alongside him. We spent the following months transforming our spare room into a serene nursery, assembling 2 wooden cribs, and carefully organizing tiny matching onesies. Mark was attentive to a fault, rubbing my feet after long work days, and speaking softly to my belly every single night. Yet, as my stomach grew, so did the dark shadow from my past. A mutual relative had casually mentioned my twin pregnancy to my mother, but neither Sylvia nor George called. Not a single text message, not a card, not a brief congratulations. Instead, I later learned through family friends that George had flown into a rage when he heard the news. He openly complained to anyone who would listen, calling it an insult to God, that a disobedient, rebellious child like me was blessed with twins, while his precious, perfect Hannah was left with empty arms. I tried my best to brush off the painful sting of their hatred. I told myself that Mark and I were creating a healthy, loving environment, far away from my father's toxic favoritism. I had no way of knowing that as my due date approached, my family was watching my growing belly from afar, quietly nurturing a sinister plan born out of envy, desperation, and total moral rot. The contractions started with a sudden, sharp intensity at 2 o'clock on a rainy Thursday morning in Austin. I woke up gasping, clutching the bed sheets as a wave of pressure rolled through my lower back and abdomen. Mark was instantly awake, his calm instincts kicking in immediately. He grabbed our pre-packed hospital bags, helped me down the stairs with gentle precision, and navigated the slick, rain-soaked streets toward St. David's Medical Center. By the time we checked into the labor unit, the contractions were coming every 3 minutes, relentless and overwhelming. Because both baby boys were in breech position, my obstetrician made the swift decision to proceed with an emergency C-section. Within an hour, I was wheeled under the cold, sterile lights of the operating suite. The sound of chirping heart monitors filled the room, while a team of surgeons worked rapidly behind a blue paper screen. I felt immense pulling pressure across my lower stomach, and then a tiny, sharp cry pierced through the quiet room. Tears immediately welled in my eyes. Less than 90 seconds later, a second, louder cry joined the first. My twin boys were officially in the world. Healthy, vocal, and absolute perfection. When the surgical team brought them over to me, bundled tightly in striped flannel blankets, Mark leaned down and pressed his lips against my temple. His face was soaked with tears, his voice cracking with pure devotion as he held my hand tightly. "They're here, Madison," he whispered, his chest heaving with emotion. "Our boys are finally here." After the surgeons carefully stitched through the multiple layers of severed tissue, muscle, and skin across my lower abdomen, I was wheeled into a quiet, private recovery room on the 4th floor. By 7 o'clock that morning, I was lying in my hospital bed, exhausted to the marrow of my bones, high on post-surgical painkillers, but floating on a cloud of absolute euphoria. My 2 baby boys, Leo and Jonah, were resting side by side in the plastic bassinet right next to my bed, breathing in soft, rhythmic puffs. Looking at their tiny, wrinkled hands and innocent faces, a deep, tender vulnerability unlocked inside me. The intense hormonal rush of childbirth, paired with the heavy pain medication, stripped away the emotional armor I had spent years building against my family. I found myself staring at the wall, thinking about my mother, Sylvia. Despite her weakness, she was still the woman who carried me. I felt a foolish, desperate longing swell up in my chest. I allowed myself to believe that the miracle of newborn twin boys, her own blood grandsons, could break through the wall of bitterness my father had built around our family. I convinced myself that no parent could hold on to hatred in the presence of new life. When Mark kissed my cheek and stepped down to the hospital cafeteria to grab us breakfast and coffee, I reached for my phone on the bedside table with trembling fingers. My hands shook as I dialed Sylvia's number, a number I hadn't called in over 2 long years. It rang 4 times before the line picked up. "Mom?" I whispered, my voice breaking with raw emotion. "It's Madison. I'm at St. David's in Austin. I just had my babies, Mom." "Twin boys. They're both healthy and perfect. I really wanted to tell you." There was a long, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. I held my breath, waiting for a soft gasp, a congratulations, or any sign of maternal warmth. Instead, I heard my mother exhale a long, heavy breath through her nose. "You always had a sick sense of timing, Madison," Sylvia said flatly, her tone completely devoid of affection. "Your sister hasn't stopped crying all week, and you call to boast about having 2? Before I could even process the cruelty of her words, the line went dead with a loud click. I lowered the phone, tears spilling hot and fast down my cheeks. I felt humiliated, naive, and deeply hurt. I forced myself to wipe my eyes, staring at my sleeping boys, telling myself to close my eyes and forget her. I had no idea that my emotional phone call hadn't just been rejected. It had ignited a fire of envy and entitlement 2 miles away. I didn't know that my father, George, was already grabbing his coat, mobilizing my mother and sister, and driving toward the hospital with a cold, sinister demand that would shatter my recovery bed into a crime scene. I tried to push the sting of that phone call out of my mind, focusing every ounce of my remaining energy on the 2 tiny miracles lying in the bassinet beside me. Around 9 in the morning, a nurse helped me shift position so I could nurse my boys for the very first time. Every tiny movement sent a sharp, pulling ache through my lower stomach, a harsh reminder of the major abdominal surgery I had undergone just hours prior. But holding those 2 fragile babies against my chest, feeling their faint heartbeats against my skin, made the surgical pain feel distant. I felt a quiet, fierce sense of peace. Then, the quiet was shattered. My hospital room door swung open with a heavy, deliberate thud, slamming against the rubber bumper on the wall. I flinched, instinctively pulling the thin hospital blanket tighter over my babies and my exposed chest. In walked my father, George. He didn't knock, he didn't smile. He wore his heavy leather jacket, standing tall with his shoulders squared, his jaw set in a hard, rigid line that I recognized all too well from my childhood. Behind him came my mother, Sylvia, her eyes darting nervously around the room like a conspirator checking for witnesses, and my sister, Hannah. Hannah's eyes were swollen and red-rimmed, but her expression wasn't one of grief. It was a cold, sharp glare directed straight at my chest. My heart plummeted into my stomach. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, laced with immediate panic. "We came to fix this, Madison," George said, his voice low, booming, and completely devoid of any softness. He didn't look at my face. His eyes locked onto the 2 infants in my arms like a predator eyeing a prize. Before I could process his words, Mark's phone buzzed from the bedside table. A second later, the door creaked open slightly, and Mark looked in. He saw my family standing over my bed, his eyebrows furrowing in immediate concern and protective anger. But his phone was ringing persistently. It was his lead structural engineer on a high-stakes construction project in downtown Austin that was experiencing an emergency site inspection. "Madison?" Mark said, stepping into the room, his eyes locked on George. "What's going on here? George, why are you in this room?" George didn't even turn his head. "Step outside, Mark. This is a private family matter. Blood business." "Mark, don't leave," I begged, terror clutching my throat. "I'm right outside the door, Madison. I'm taking this call right here in the hallway," Mark said firmly, giving my father a cold, warning look. If you make one wrong move, George, I'm calling security. Mark pulled the door almost completely shut, stepping into the hallway, his voice audible just inches away as he answered his client. The moment the latch clicked, the atmosphere in the room turned suffocatingly toxic. George stepped closer to the edge of my bed, hovering over me like an executioner. Sylvia closed the remaining distance, while Hannah moved to the opposite side of my bed, staring down at my twin boys with an unsettling, possessive intensity. You shouldn't have called your mother if you didn't want us here, Madison, George began, his voice dripping with condescension. You brought this on yourself. You've had your fun playing the victim for 2 years, but today, reality catches up with you. Get out of my room, I rasped, trying to shift my body, but the sharp pain of my fresh C-section stitches trapped me in place. Get out before I press the nurse call button. Touch that button and I'll make sure Mark's career in this city is ruined before sunset, George snapped, taking a threatening step forward. He leaned down, placing both palms flat on the guardrail of my hospital bed, forcing me to lean back against my pillows. Look at your sister, Madison, George commanded, pointing a heavy finger at Hannah, who was fighting back bitter tears. Look at her. Hannah has suffered for 5 years. She is a good, obedient daughter, who built a life the right way. She deserves a family. She deserves a child. And what do? You go and have 2. I stared at him, stunned, my brain refusing to process the sheer absurdity and horror of what he was implying. What are you talking about, Dad? Sylvia stepped forward, her hands wringing together, her voice dropping into a sickeningly sweet, manipulative whisper. Maddie, sweetie, listen to your father. You have 2 boys. 2. It's too much for you and Mark anyway. You're both working full-time. Hannah can't have any. It's only fair. It's God's way of balancing things out. The room seemed to spin. The air grew thin. Are you insane? I choked out, tears of horror spilling over my eyelashes. These are my sons. They are family blood, George roared, slapping his hand against the bed rail, making both babies startle and cry. We are taking one of these boys today. You will sign the private adoption papers quietly, or so help me God, I will disown you in a way that ensures you never sleep peacefully again. You owe your sister this. You owe this family. I looked into the eyes of my father, my mother, and my sister, and realized with sickening clarity that I wasn't looking at human beings who loved me. I was looking at monsters who had come to steal my child from my very arms. I gripped my newborn sons so tightly against my collarbone that I could feel their fragile little heartbeats vibrating against my chest. Over my dead body, I gasped, through heavy, ragged sobs. You are sick. All 3 of you are completely insane. Get away from my babies. Don't you dare talk to your father like that, Hannah shrieked, her face twisting into a mask of pure, ugly rage. She lunged forward across the side of my bed, her manicured fingers reaching straight for my baby Leo's flannel blanket. He's mine. You don't even deserve 1 baby, let alone 2. Touch him and I'll kill you, I screamed at the top of my lungs, twisting my upper body violently to shield my children from Hannah's grasping hands. That sudden, jerky movement tore through my core, sending an excruciating explosion of pain straight through my fresh incision. I gasped for air, momentarily paralyzed by the agony, but my grip on my sons never loosened. My father's eyes went completely wild. He had never in his life been defied like this, least of all by me, the daughter he thought he had broken years ago. The sheer shock of my defiance pushed him over the edge into absolute, criminal madness. You ungrateful, selfish bitch, George roared. Before my mother or sister could even react, George reared back his right arm, tightened his heavy fist, and smashed it directly into the side of my head. The force of the blow rattled my skull, knocking my vision into a dizzying spin of white light and darkness. I sagged sideways against the pillows, whimpering, but my arms instinctively locked like steel bands around my crying infants. George wasn't finished. Seeing that I was still holding the boys, his face contorted in monstrous fury. He raised his heavy fist again and drove a brutal, full-force punch directly into my lower abdomen, right onto the fresh, bloody site of my C-section operation. A sound tore from my throat that didn't even sound human. It felt like a red-hot blade had been plunged into my stomach and twisted. I felt the horrifying, sickening pop of surgical thread snapping under my skin, followed by a sudden, sickening rush of hot blood soaking through my bandages and blooming dark crimson across my yellow hospital gown. The pain was so pure, so overwhelming, that my vision went completely black for 2 terrifying seconds. "Dad, stop!" Sylvia screamed, finally jolting backward in terror as blood pooled onto the white sheets. "Get the kid!" George snarled at Hannah, his breathing heavy as he reached down to pry my blood-stained fingers off my son. "Mark! Help me! Mark!" I shrieked with every remaining drop of oxygen in my lungs. The door burst open with violent force. Mark slammed into the room, his phone clattering to the linoleum floor. He took in the horrifying scene in a fraction of a second, the blood pouring from my abdomen, my father hovering over me with raised fists, and Hannah trying to wrench our crying son from my trembling arms. "Get your hands off my wife," Mark roared. Mark charged forward like a freight train, shoving my father back with such violent force that George crashed hard against the wall, rattling the medical equipment. Mark threw his body over me, and the babies like a human shield, his face pale with horror as he saw the blood soaking my lap. He reached over with one hand and slammed the red emergency call button on the wall, holding it down as the room's high-pitched distress alarm began to wail incessantly. The high-pitched emergency alarm blared continuously, piercing the chaotic room with deafening intensity. Within 10 seconds, 3 charge nurses and 2 security guards burst through the door. The lead nurse took one look at the pool of fresh crimson blood expanding across my surgical gown, my pale, sweat-slicked face, and Mark shielding our weeping twins, and immediately shouted into her radio for an emergency trauma team. George, realizing the situation had spun entirely out of his control, smoothed down his leather jacket and adopted an air of offended authority. "This woman is hysterical," George bellowed to the guards, pointing a trembling finger at me. "She lost her temper during a private family discussion and threw herself out of bed. We came here out of love to support her, and she attacked us." Sylvia immediately chimed in, wringing her hands and sobbing fake tears. "It's true. She's postpartum. She's completely unstable. She hit her own stomach in a fit of rage. We were just trying to protect the grandbabies." Hannah backed toward the corner, nodding frantically, trying to look like a traumatized victim. Mark was on his knees beside my bed, his hands desperately applying pressure to my bleeding abdomen while keeping a protective arm over our screaming boys. "They assaulted her!" Mark screamed at the guards, his voice raw with fury and terror. "He punched her C-section. Call the police right now." 2 Austin police officers, already stationed in the hospital lobby, rushed into the room within 3 minutes. George stepped toward them smoothly, offering his hand. "Officers, thank God you're here. I'm George Sterling. My daughter is having a severe psychotic break." "Quiet down, sir. Nobody moves," the lead officer barked, unclipping his taser as more nurses wheeled an emergency surgical cart into the room to stabilize my vitals and check the babies. While the doctor began frantically patching my ruptured incision, the responding officer turned to the security guard. "Shut down this room. Nobody leaves. Is there footage?" The security guard looked up, pointing directly at the small black dome camera mounted on the ceiling tile right above the foot of my bed. "Every single inch of this room is recorded 24/7 on high-definition audio and video." George's face drained of every ounce of color. His arrogant posture collapsed in an instant. Sylvia gasped, covering her mouth, while Hannah burst into genuine, terrified sobs. The officer stepped out to the nurse's station monitor with the security lead. 90 seconds later, he walked back into the room, his jaw tightly set, his eyes cold as ice. He didn't say a word to George. He simply unclipped 2 pairs of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "George Sterling, you are under arrest for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, causing serious bodily injury to a high-risk surgical patient," the officer announced firmly. He grabbed George's arms, twisting them behind his back, and slammed the cuffs shut with a sharp, heavy click. "Wait, you don't understand. She's my daughter," George shouted, his voice cracking as the reality of his actions finally crashed down on him. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer snapped, dragging my pale, trembling father out into the crowded hallway in front of dozens of doctors, nurses, and patients. A second officer turned to Sylvia and Hannah. "Both of you are coming with us as accomplices to domestic violence and filing false police reports." As the steel cuffs clicked around their wrists, my mother looked back at me, her eyes filled with pathetic, desperate pleading. I didn't say a word. I just pulled my sons closer to my chest as the police marched my family away in shame. The legal system in Travis County moved with absolute, unforgiving precision. The CCTV footage from St. David's Medical Center was crystal clear, capturing every second of my father's brutal assault and my family's chilling attempt to extort my newborn child. There was no room for spin, no slick attorney who could talk their way around 4K video showing a man punching his daughter's freshly stitched surgical wound. George was convicted of Class 1 felony aggravated assault. The judge called his actions a horrific display of monstrous entitlement and sickening cruelty before sentencing him to 2 years in Texas State Prison without the possibility of early parole. He is currently serving his time in a medium security facility, stripped of his local business influence and abandoned by the social circle he worked his whole life to impress. My mother, Sylvia, and my sister, Hannah, both pleaded guilty to charges of aiding in domestic violence, disorderly conduct,